Greetings. Welcome back to the Rose Bros podcast. This episode, we are joined by Chris Slubicki, most recently President, CEO, and Director of Modern Resources, a Calgary-based private oil and gas company which was sold to Tourmaline Oil for approximately $150 million in 2020. From 2009 to 2011, Chris was the CEO of OPTI Canada, which was sold to CNOOC for approximately $2 billion in 2011. Chris is also the former Vice-Chairman of Scotia Waterous and was one of the four original founders of Waterous and Co, a private global oil and gas mergers and acquisitions firm starting in Calgary in 1989. Chris graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Queen's University and also has an MBA degree from the University of Calgary. He is a professional engineer in Alberta and a member of OPTI. Chris also served on the board of Alpine Canada for 7 years and was the chair for the last 2 years. He has coached young ski racers for years at the Fernie Alpine ski team, where he has also served as the president of the club. We sat down for a smooth cup of Rose Bros coffee and discussed entrepreneurial success, the easiest way to reduce carbon emissions, opaque green energy policies, Jevons paradox, why the Canadian energy industry benefits all Canadians, and why the world needs more of it. Enjoy. Also, this podcast is sponsored by HeadRacingCanada.com. Looking for high-performance ski gear this winter? In partnership with four-time Olympian Manny Osborne Parody, HeadRacingCanada.com is offering the lowest prices possible through its online storefront by passing brick-and-mortar savings on to customers. Check out HeadRacingCanada.com for more info and get your high-performance ski gear for the upcoming season. When you're ready, we can...
Fire away.
We can start.
Fire away.
Chris Slubicki, thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
I know you're busy and there's not much time in the day, so thanks a lot.
I'm happy to be here.
I guess to start from the top, you're an engineer, you're an entrepreneur, you were an investment banker, you're the chair of Alpine Canada. How would you describe yourself nowadays?
I'd say I'm retired, but I don't like using that word because I feel too young for that. And I would say leading a very good life. I spend 7 months of my life based out of Fernie, BC, and 5 months based out of my cottage in Barrows Bay, Ontario. Within that, we spend some time in Calgary, of course, and we do a lot of traveling. So it's a good life. But I've been in the energy industry in Calgary for 40 years. Definitely a bit of that's missing right now.
You're also a ski racer.
I was a ski racer, not a very good one. I started when I was 13, thanks to my parents who were wonderful people. And I was a bit of a kid making some poor decisions in life. And they were very concerned as to what they should do. So they signed me up into ski racing when I was 13. And I was very opposed to that. I thought that's a dumb idea. Ski racing is for losers. But I got into it. And I had a coach named John Solhamel who took me under his wing and I would say changed my life. He invited me to stay at a tiny with his family, a little chalet in a place called Mansfield, north of Toronto. Must have been 600 square feet, 2-bedroom. His kids stayed in 1 bedroom, my parents in the other. I brought my sleeping bag. I slept on the couch on Saturday nights and I wouldn't dare show up on Saturday morning not prepared. So I cleaned up my act. I was never a great ski racer, but I sure loved it. And of course, it's become a huge part of our life, skiing in Fernie, coaching ski racing in Fernie for 14 years. I was on the board of the Fernie Alpine ski team for 12 years, I think. I was president for 3. I was on the board of Alpine Canada for 7 years, chairperson for 2. So I would say I drank the Kool-Aid for sure.
Was it goal to make the national team?
No, not at all. No? I was, okay. Well, I would have loved it, but I was never really a contender. It was a different system back then in Ontario. But I sure loved it. You know, it was a great passion, but I think I knew school was the better option.
Good thing about skiing is you can do it most of your life too.
Well, you know, it's been a huge part of our life in Fernie. My wife is a very avid and first-rate skier. Our first date was skiing. Our children grew up skiing, ski racing, coaching. My son is still an instructor today, and it's been a huge and wonderful part of our life.
Did you always want to be an entrepreneur?
No. I'd say I'm not sure I knew what an entrepreneur was. I grew up in a middle-class family in Toronto. My father was an engineer, worked for the Department of Highways in Ontario. My mother was a school teacher. She taught calculus in high school. And, my view on life was when you grow up, and you go to school, you're either, a doctor, lawyer, engineer, architect, nurse, school teacher. Those are your options. I'm sure I missed a bunch, but that was kind of your options. So I went into engineering at Queen's. I'm a mechanical engineer. I focused on nuclear power. When I graduated the year after the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania. So there were no jobs. I came to Alberta. I was lucky enough to get a job with Chevron. And I mainly came here, though, to ski. I thought I'd stay for a couple of years and move on. But when I got to Calgary, I just loved it here. It was 1981. Calgary was go, 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 work hard, play hard. When I lived in Ontario, I thought the mountains were great for skiing. It wasn't until I got here I realized all the other things you can do in the mountains, the year-round endeavor. So I just loved it here. And I knew very quickly that although engineering is a first-rate profession, it wasn't really for me. And I was working for Chevron, who treated me incredibly well. I had lunch yesterday with a senior executive from Chevron, and I told him that I didn't realize till years later just how well they treated us, young professionals there, not just me, but all the young people there in terms of opportunity, responsibility, training. But I knew I didn't want to be a big company person. So I was doing my MBA, and I happened to bump into Brett Wilson at a cocktail party, who was working with a startup called Waterous and Co at the time. And he convinced me to come see them on Monday morning. And I joined Waterous and Co, an investment bank, a startup. There was 4 of us at the time. And I didn't really know what an investment bank was, but I knew I'd found my calling, that a startup, starting a company, being more entrepreneurial, was where I wanted to be.
Did it take much convincing? I guess Brett Wilson wasn't the Brett Wilson we know today. He wasn't
he was a young engineer
then.
too.
Yeah.
So, he actually came from another investment bank. He came from Scotia, but
was it a tough decision?
No, it was a very easy decision because first of all, I was single. I had no children. Mm-hmm. I had a tiny little house in Rosedale that was paid for. And I thought, if I'm ever going to take a risk in my life, now's the time. And if I have to eat craft dinner for a few years, that's okay. Mm-hmm. But if I'm ever going to take a risk in my life, now's the time. So I joined, I think it was 1989, 90, I can't remember. And I would say the first 5 years, we never struggled. We never lost money, but we never made money. We were just kind of feeding ourselves, and we weren't buying fancy cars or houses or anything else. But I never once stopped believing in the business that we would eventually catch on and do well. And then when it did start to catch on, it really snowballed. And by the time we sold it in 2005 to the Bank of Nova Scotia, we had offices in Calgary, Denver, Houston, London, England, Buenos Aires, and Singapore.
Did you spot a market opportunity? Because at that time, I guess Peters & Co was going, and so there was other people in that field. Did it seem like a hole in the market from your perspective?
Well, I think there was a big hole in the market. It was a much different business, the investment banking business back then. It was purely a financial business, a lot of CFAs, a lot of analysts, which are an important part of the business. But it really wasn't considered to be a technical business, and I can't take credit for it. I think it was Jeff Waterous and Sandra Powell at the time, Sandra Fiel today, who decided that they're going to be an advisory firm, mergers and acquisitions, asset sales in the energy business, and they need some technical bench strength. So I spent 9 years as an operations engineer, drilling completions workovers. So that's why they brought me in, was to have a technical aspect to an investment bank, which at the time was a new thing. We eventually brought in geologists as well. And I think that's what really differentiated us from our competitors, because today all the investment banks have a A&D group with engineers, geologists. All of them are very technically savvy. But in 1989, 1990, that wasn't the case.
So there's Peters & Co., there's Waterous, then I guess First Energy started, and there was a bunch of other ones, merchant banks and whatnot, they all kind of had the same business. What do you think separated Waterous from everyone else? What made you guys successful?
Well, at the time, again, back the bus up to 1990, we really had one competitor, and it was a gentleman named Ross Kobayashi, who was a first-rate individual. He had a very good business, but he really focused on smaller deals, the smaller end of the market, and very intentionally. And we had numerous discussions with Ross. We talked about merging at one point, but he just said, I just like to remain small. So that was a real blessing for us. And, I used to talk about it a year after I joined. Jeff's brother, Adam Waterous, joined, who's well known in the industry today. And Adam and I used to talk about it, in the evening in the office when no one else was listening, that we had this phenomenal business, great market share, and virtually no competitors. And so we didn't hold big parties. We didn't drive fancy cars. We just kept a low profile, kept our, nose to the grindstone, worked hard, kept at it. But eventually, of course, competition comes along. First Energy started. They were a good competitor, Tri-Stone. But by that time, and of course, all the other banks, all the major banks, Royal Bank, Bank of Montreal, CIBC started their own A&D groups. But by that time, we were already international. We were very active in South America, in Europe, in Asia. So although the Calgary market always remained very important to us, we weren't relying on strictly the Calgary market. So we maintained a very good business.
Did you have to put much money in to start, or was it more of an investment of your time?
I'd say it was an investment of our time. We put in, and again, it was Jeff Waterous. I have to give credit where credit's due. It was a very small amount of money. As I said, we didn't make any money for a number of years, but I would say, and also we took some big risks, which in hindsight, I think were insane risks. And these are the kind of things you do in business school as case studies, and you roll your eyes. Who would ever do something so foolish? Well, we did. And so when we started expanding in 1996, I'm guessing maybe 97, we in the same year opened up an office in London, England, and Houston, Texas. And at the time, the Canadian dollar was 60 cents. So we're financing 2 new offices in 2 of the most expensive places on the planet with a 60-cent Canadian dollar. And it almost killed us. We almost didn't make it. But luckily, by the skin of our teeth, we ended up with some good contracts in those offices, and they started to roll, and we made it. But in hindsight, it was a big risk. It was probably an insane risk, and we were lucky enough to get away with it. And sometimes you have to count yourself lucky too.
You've been on the producer side and the M&A investment banking side. Do you have a preference? Do you like doing deals, big deals? Or do you like drilling wells and being an engineer?
I'd say I don't like, I like doing deals. It was a great business. I loved the clients all over the world, still have contact with people all over the world, traveled a ton, too much. But I would say the thrill was growing the business. It wasn't the thrill of the deal, so to say. I mean, I enjoyed it. But it was the thrill was the challenge of the business, growing the business. And it was challenging. Every year, the slate, January 1st, it's a clean slate. Another year, I have to get at it. We had 88 people in the company, a lot of mouths to feed, a lot of different basins we were working in. And, it was a challenge every year. It was never easy, so that was the thrill, was growing and maintaining the company.
Investment banking is a lot of relationship driven. And who knows who and where the capital goes, and deals are done and sourced and whatnot. Do you get frustrated that although you may be technically competent, that deals were kind of based on who likes who and who knows who? Did that ever frustrate you, or how did you manage that aspect of that?
Nobody knew any of us. We were a bunch of nobodies, so to speak. And I would say I have to thank 2 companies, Encore and Petro-Canada, who took a flyer on us. We were nobody. We had no track record. We had an idea, and they had faith in us. And if it wasn't for those 2 companies, we never would have made it. So, and then once you have a few assignments and people get to know you, you start getting a reputation. And again, it took a few years, but I think, it gets a bit easier. When you call someone, they answer your call. So I would say, we started from zero. We didn't know anybody, but we had 2 companies that really took a flyer on us, and that was the tipping point. That's what made us got our foot in the door.
And the pie was growing. as the duties went on?
The Canadian oil and gas industry, in terms of, and this is, oil sands were not a huge part of the industry at the time. In terms of reserves and production at the time, was a rounding error in the global energy scene. But it was, fortunately for us, the epicenter of transactions, because the industry was so heavily and well supported by the financial markets. So there was, literally hundreds of companies. Transactions were, a few a day, and well supported by the capital markets. So we started in a great basin, the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, and we didn't truly appreciate it until we expanded elsewhere. At the time, there was 2 or 3 companies based in Edmonton, CNOOC, a couple of others, but virtually every company was within a 10-minute walk of our office. So you could service the entire Canadian energy industry, oil and gas industry, within 10 minutes. We didn't even have to get a taxi. When we started going internationally, you'd fly all the way to South Korea and have a meeting, and then it takes you a day to get to Delhi to have another meeting, and it was so efficient here in Canada. So we were very fortunate that Calgary was such a transaction-driven epicenter of the energy industry.
One of the criticisms of the energy industry is a lot of deals went on, but not much value was created. As things got super busy, did you have to turn down business that was not quality deals, or how did you manage that from your reputation perspective?
Well, a lot of what we did was competitive sales process. So on those ones, we would be hired to sell an asset or a company, and we'd put it out to the market, and high financed bidder wins. So we didn't set the value. And that's what really differentiated us originally, because before that, people just did deals one-on-one on a handshake and say, my reserve report says it's worth $100. I think it's worth $100. You think it's worth $100. Let's do a deal. What we started to do is put it out competitively, technically look at it and say, the reserve report says it's worth $100, but there's additional value here, and put it out to a bid. And I think what really made our business successful was not our abilities and it was people would bid on assets or companies through us, and they'd say, I think it's worth $100. So here's my $100 bid. And we would sell it for $200, and they would just be flabbergasted, like, oh my God. So when they went to sell something, their asset or their company, they thought, well, we think it's worth $100, but maybe they can get us $200. And that's how we made our business. And certainly we did advisory work too. We took a lot of ideas to people. But, I like to think, I certainly believe we were, had integrity. We didn't pitch things we didn't believe in. I don't know how you could, look somebody in the eye and try to, and also I think that's a very short-term thinking. If you start pitching things that you don't believe strictly for the fee, you're not going to be in business very long. It's a high trust business. And if people don't trust you, I don't care what you're proposing, they're not going to hire you.
Do you remember any deals that seem to have gone from 10 cents to $10 when you stick out in your mind that was the best deal you ever saw in terms of making value, creating value?
I can think of many, but I don't want to really say, because I don't want to embarrass any vendors who, maybe could have held on longer and done things differently. There was a few of those. But, hindsight's always easy. It's, at the time, I can tell you, we always thought this is the best deal, possible. And obviously both parties agreed to it. But sometimes, a year, 5 years later, you have a different point of view.
Yeah. I mean, a few examples like CNRL or Tourmaline or any of those companies you'd started. Well,
Tourmaline started after I was in the investment banking business. Certainly CNRL was probably our biggest buyer. We never acted for them as a seller. They were a very disciplined, knowledgeable buyer. They did their homework. They knew what they were doing, still do. And they also, Warren Buffett saying about be bold when others are fearful. When things were down, they were out shopping. And at the time, it seemed they were paying full price, but in the long run, they've obviously done it extremely well.
Capital allocation.
Well, and disciplined capital allocation. They bought when the cycle was low. Have bought a lot, and have done obviously very well.
You've been in the industry for a long time. Has it become easier to gauge the cycles as you've been in the industry longer? Are you able to look around and say to yourself, I think we're in the bottom or I think we're at the top? How have you thought of it from that perspective?
Boy, if I knew that,
does it get easier?
I'd be on my super yacht somewhere. But no, I don't think so. It's a commodity business, and as much as you can run a good company and be disciplined, at the end of the day, it's a commodity business. So, and you can hedge, you can do things to somewhat manage the risk. But, look at the last year with what the rebound in natural gas prices. 2 years ago, if you looked at the financial markets, the forward strip on natural gas was $2 for 5 years. A year later, it's at $7. And nobody saw that coming. But, things such as the war in the Ukraine, no one can predict these things, and no one can predict the effect it'll have, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, these kinds of things. There's always unknown variables. So I don't think you can predict, anybody can predict the cycles. I certainly cannot, but I think what you can do is manage your business well so that you can survive the downturns and take advantage and be active in the highs of the cycle. So I think it's managing your business to survive those cycles as opposed to predicting the cycles.
Do you ever look around, like say maybe 2008 or in the real boom times in the 90s and think to yourself, maybe things are a little too good and that valuations are way too high and you think, well, we got to slow down here? Or how did you think of it?
There were times where it just seemed too easy, too much money flowing into the business. And I think too, I'm an Albertan. I'm a very passionate Albertan. I'm a very passionate Canadian. But I think times were a bit too good in Calgary. And we saw it all in the Fridays off and the annual bonuses and the salary levels in Calgary compared to other parts of the country. It was just an anomaly. I graduated from Queen's University. I have friends who went to work for General Motors and whatever. I talked to them. And it's a different world, it's just a different world. So, those things are maybe fun while they last, but a little bit of sanity is a good thing.
The collective ego of Calgary seems to have corrected itself maybe a little bit in the last few years, a few scars and whatnot.
Well, the last downturn was certainly the longest of my career and probably most severe. Mm-hmm. So that tends to be humbling. And we'll see what happens now. Times are good again in terms of commodity prices. There does seem so far to be financial discipline and people are paying down debt and paying out dividends as opposed to just grow, which was the mantra in the past. And my own view is too, the industry has been under huge pressure on the environmental front and maybe in many cases rightly so. I think the industry and companies should get on top of that, dedicate capital to cleaning up well sites in a big way, in a very vocal way. Like, let people know that we are on top of this. Change the image of the industry because the image has the industry has a brute. Do
you think capital allocation, return of capital to shareholders is the best strategy nowadays, or would you still be going for full growth, maybe going the other way from everyone else if you were in the driver's seat today?
Well, when I was at Modern, we're certainly a high growth company, but, growth within your means type of thing. So, and, we were owned by private equity. So, at the end of the day, it's all about return to shareholders. So I would say, we were definitely biased towards return to shareholders. So I would think today the company was sold to Tourmaline 2 years ago. So, but, I do think focusing on return to shareholders as opposed to the previous 40 years where it was all about the cycles and hoping you buy at the right time and sell at the right time. It's a bit short-term thinking. So, I do think a bit of calmness, lower debt levels, dividends to shareholders, addressing environmental liabilities. Environmental liabilities are just another form of debt on your balance sheet. It's an obligation of the firm. Maybe not as visible as a bank debt or a line of credit or a bond. But I think addressing all those is a smarter way to go.
In the old days, you just sell the company and you forget about it. Whereas now it seems like between shareholders demanding capital returns and then the environmental aspect, companies are being forced to think more long term, it seems like.
Well, I think it's just the right thing to do. That's a good driver. I had a friend named Dick Lewis. He had a company in Denver, Colorado. It was called Prima, and we sold it in 2001 or something to Petro Canada. But he told me, and I never forgot this, he said when he has a tough business decision, you look at all the spreadsheets and the rates of return and all the assumptions, and you look at the reams of analysis. But he said, I always ask myself at the end of the day, what's the right thing to do? And he said, I found that to be a good driver. And I've never forgotten that. So I think, whether it's addressing the liabilities, debt, environmental liabilities, treating your shareholders well, it's the right thing to do.
When you were leading companies and whatnot, was it, in those days, it seemed like growing production was the most important part of, I guess, the industry, and everyone perceived the companies in certain ways if they grew production, but maybe creating value for shareholders was sometimes forgotten. Did you think to yourself at those times that we need to really focus on making money for the shareholders and we don't need to drill every year? How did you?
Well, at the time, most of those years I was in the investment banking business, and that mindset was great for our business because capital was available. People wanted to buy so they could grow. So, from our perspective, that was a very positive part of the business. So I wasn't, a CEO of an oil and gas company in those days.
Right.
It was a different mindset. And, at the time, you have to, it's not that people were fools at the time because they weren't.
Yeah.
It's easy, but, that was the successful formula, and many people did very well. Many shareholders did very well. So that was the successful formula. And, at the time, but things change.
It's easy to criticize now, but for every buyer, there was a seller too. So there was a lot of value made on, I guess, each end of those transactions that people don't talk about. A lot of people sold in those days too.
Yeah, well, and they sold and they sometimes they sold because of financial duress, but I would say mostly they sold because they did very well. They started with $100, they sold for $1,000. They were very happy, and then maybe the buyer went on to make another $1,000, but the seller sold because they had done well, and that's why people kept reinvesting in the business because they had done well.
Did you ever think to yourself when things would slow down did you ever see like the boat kind of turning and that maybe things are not going to be so easy anymore? Was there ever moments when you said to yourself, okay, we need to change the way we're thinking about things and this industry seems to be changing? Was there inflection points like maybe 2015 or something?
In my mind, it was before that. And I'd say the big change in my mindset was the focus on the environment, which, by the way, I think is a good thing. I'm not, I'm a believer in climate change. I think we have to reduce emissions. I think we're going to be producing oil and gas for decades to come. I know we will be, but not as we did in the past. We have to do better. But I think the big, I was president of a oil sands company called OPTI in 2009 to 2011. We sold it to CNOOC. At the time, we were selling an oil sands company, and people didn't really talk about CO2. And this is only 12 years ago. It's not 40 years ago. But it was definitely starting up. It was getting more and more on the radar. So when we started Modern Resources in 2013, so 10 years ago this month, we put together a list of 9 things that we thought made a successful leading 21st century oil and gas company. And, by our name, Modern Resources, we're going to be a modern oil and gas company. And so we had a list of 9 things. So we had on there, control of infrastructure, repeatable resource, low finding costs, low operating costs, access to markets, all these things. But number 1 on our list was ESG performance. And in 2013, that was still, it was on the radar, but it wasn't what it is today. But boy, did that ever turn out to be a smart move or a lucky move. And, by the time 2018, 19, 20, when things were really tough, the focus on ESG was, I would say, the first thing. When you went to sell an asset or a company, the first thing people would look at is ESG. If that doesn't stand up, then no one's interested. And I'd say Modern, thanks to our technical people, became very well known as being an ESG leader. We were never the biggest company in the business. We peaked at about 20,000 BOE a day. But we were certainly known as an ESG, if not the ESG leader in the business. And that gave us, we could punch above our weight class because of that in terms of dealing with other companies, dealing with governments in terms of policy being at the table. So that turned out to be whether it was smart or lucky, I can't remember, but that turned out to be a very good move.
A lot of energy executives like to complain about attacks on the energy industry. A lot of people in general, but not many actually go out, stick their neck out, and become a champion for the industry like you do. What motivates you to do that? You don't have to work anymore. You could go chase powder all winter long. You could go lie on a beach. What motivates you to speak up for the industry?
Well, I'm a passionate Canadian, and, I'm a passionate Albertan, of course, as well. But at the end of the day, I'm a Canadian. I love this country coast to coast to coast. And it bothers me to see the country being so divided over matters of energy and the environment. And I don't say this lightly. People in this country hate each other. And I don't use the word hate lightly over matters of energy and the environment. That's not productive. Vilifying people, pointing fingers, and this is from both sides of the issue. Vilifying people, calling them names, spreading misinformation does not reduce greenhouse gases one iota. The energy industry is the largest industry in the country. We do offer a lot to this country, and we have a lot more to offer this country and the world. And it bothers me to see us sitting on the sidelines. The LNG industry, which is an important source and becoming more and more important source of global energy. For most of the last decade, the transfer of wealth from consuming countries to producing countries in LNG was about 200 to 300 billion a year. Last year, it was 800 billion. This year, it's going to exceed $1 trillion. $1 trillion going to the producing countries. Canada's share of that, zero. Why? Because we were so smart, we did nothing. We called each other names, we fought, we protested, we vilified, and we got nothing done. And capital went elsewhere to places where standards of worker safety standards, gender equality standards, religious standards, environmental standards are nowhere near what Canada is. The world would be much better off if it came from Canada. Canada would be much better off. But what did we do? We fought until we did nothing. $1 trillion, Canada's share, zero. Boy, were we ever smart. We have to up our game. We have to calm the conversation down. It's complicated. The environmental issues are real, but we have to calm it down and actually move this country forward. We're never going to attain a reduction in GSG globally without building things. And we should be building those things here in Canada because we're really good at it.
What does a healthy energy industry mean to Canada in terms of dollars contributed and distributed across country in terms of hospital, roads, schools, transfer payments? What does that mean?
Well,
billions of dollars.
Take LNG, just LNG. Forget oil, forget natural gas for a minute. LNG is a form of natural gas, but forget just the LNG portion. $1 trillion this year. So this isn't some, time 100 years in the future. This is right now. $1 trillion. Let's say Canada got 10% of that. We could have done that. That's $100 billion a year flowing into this country. $100 billion. So say 20% of that is taxes and royalties. I'm making these numbers up. $20 billion. How many hospitals can we build? How much green energy can we develop? How much high voltage transmission lines can we build? Which is something we need in this country to access clean energy in places that don't have the good fortune of having hydro. We can do a lot. We can do an awful lot if we just get going instead of vilifying, fighting, name calling, lawsuits. We've come to a standstill and we see it in the productivity of the nation declining. And I'd say there's a second aspect to it, which is equally as important, if not more important. And that's, reconciliation. I think for, the first 500 years Canada was here, the First Nations, the Indigenous Canadians were virtually ignored. It wasn't until the late 1900s, the 1990s that we started with consultation, which was a start. And then the standard was raised to FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. But in the last 5 years, there's been a complete sea change in terms of Indigenous participation in Canada's natural resources. And I'm not talking only oil and gas. I'm talking mining. I'm talking about hydro. I'm talking about any form of natural resource agriculture. And that is a sea change. Now we can develop resources in Canada truly for the benefit of all Canadians, and finally look to getting our First Nations out of this cycle of poverty, which has been 500 years in the making. And it's not going to be solved in the next year. But I think what's happened in the last 5 years has been a sea change, and we're finally on a path to truly get our Indigenous Canadians, our First Nations communities out of poverty.
That's the thing. It seems like maybe not everybody realizes just the financial implications that would affect everybody, the money that could flow across the country in terms of more energy production in Canada, the lost opportunity in that sense.
Well, we think here in Alberta, it's an Alberta issue.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, Alberta is maybe the epicenter, but BC has a large energy industry, both oil, natural gas particularly, and hydro. So there's a huge energy industry in BC. Newfoundland has hydro. They're starting wind now, and of course has a huge oil industry, potentially natural gas too. We'll see if they develop that in LNG. But so it's not, having an active energy industry in Canada is not only benefiting in Alberta, it benefits Canada. It's coast to coast, and of course it's not only the taxes and royalties. When we develop oil and gas resources here in Alberta, BC, and Newfoundland, we need equipment from all over the country, valves, steel from Ontario, buses from Quebec. Like we source materials from across the country. The whole country benefits in many ways. So let's get on with it. Let's do it to the highest environmental standards in the world with full Indigenous participation. Let's supply energy to Canada and to the rest of the world.
One analogy that makes sense to me is the economic capital cogwheel, I guess you could say. When one starts spinning here in Alberta, it spins another one over here, and then that one spins it over there, and it kind of just spreads out across the country. So if you can get the one engine going, that benefits everybody.
Well, as I said, I'm a passionate Canadian, so I want to see all of Canada do well.
Exactly.
And certainly the energy industry in Canada, again, not just Alberta, but in Canada, is probably the largest driver, the largest single driver. So let's get it going with full respect and full attention to both the environment and to Indigenous Canadians. The industry could do so much for this country and the world. We're Canada in total. Not the energy industry, but in total, all of us, are 1.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We vilified ourselves so much in Canada. I think most Canadians think we're probably 90%, but we're 1.6%. So, to draw the other extreme, if we shut the country down today, we just said we're not doing anything. We're not driving our cars. We're not heating our homes. We're not cooking our meals. We're not traveling on holidays anymore. We're shutting in agriculture, mining, forestry, auto manufacturing, oil and gas. We're shutting it all down. Global emissions would be reduced by 1.6% for a nanosecond, but instantly other countries would pick up all those things because the world needs those things. And it's not like the rest of the world would say, good work, Canada, we'll take care of you. We'd be here living in a cave. All the things that we used to do would be done elsewhere to lower environmental standards. So likely the global emissions would actually go up. So let's keep our heads on straight here. We're 1.6%, and the biggest impact we can have as a country, we should reduce our emissions for sure. But the biggest impact we can have as a country is to send LNG, natural gas, other forms of energy to other countries to reduce their emissions, displace coal, displace cow dung. There's almost 1 billion people on this earth that are still using wood and cow dung as their primary source of energy. We live in energy arrogance here in Canada. That's what I call it, energy arrogance. We live such a high quality of life, and we point our fingers at people, and you should do this and you shouldn't do that. That's easy to say when you live our standard of living, but I tell people, go to the slums of Mumbai, go to the slums of Cairo, go to the slums of Buenos Aires, go to the slums of Rio de Janeiro, and tell me those people can't have energy. If you go there and you can tell me that, you have no heart. You have no heart.
Energy production is directly correlated to the standard of living. We're more focused on Kardashians, it seems like, most of the time in the Western world.
I know. I think, again, I'm not complaining. We're so fortunate as Canadians. And,
very lucky.
Yeah. I tell people when I give, talks, I say, the day you are born in or immigrate to this country, you've won the lottery of life. And what you do with it, that's up to you, but you've won the lottery of life. And never in my life, or my memory, do I think that's more relevant than today, and more in people's minds than today, I hope, with what's happened in the Ukraine. Look what the people in the Ukraine are going through. It's unimaginable. It's completely unimaginable. And you look at what's going on in South America, Venezuela, Peru, in North Korea, the threats in China, Taiwan. Where on this planet would you rather live today? Yet people think they're hard done by, because of these environmental issues, that we've been poor performers. And there's no doubt we could have done better, and we have to do better going forward. But let's do that.
It seems like opaque environmental policies have actually backfired on the country and the world in general. For instance, coal production is at a record high right now. In your opinion, what is the right way to go forward? Because we need energy, so you need traditional energy balance with a renewable source on the base load. But how would you approach it? What would you do?
Well, first of all, it's a multi-decade issue. There's no fast answer, and there's no silver bullet answer. I still go to the occasional conference, and I do a lot of reading, and you hear people say, it has to be small modular. It has to be nuclear fusion. Exactly. We have to get nuclear fission back. It's all going to be hydrogen. If it was that simple, we'd be done by now. It's not that simple. It's highly complex, and it's going to take decades. So you're right. Natural gas is at an all-time high. Coal's at an all-time high. Oil hasn't quite recovered to pre-pandemic, but it will probably this year. And, again, when people build a wind farm or solar farm, which I am 100% in favor of, I think it's fascinating technology. It's getting better all the time. Love it. It's so, as an energy geek, you have to love that stuff. And they call it, kind of energy transition, but really it's energy addition, because our need for energy keeps growing so much. Not just the 6.5 billion people in the world who don't get to live our lifestyle because they don't have the energy we have, but even us, who have infinite energy, and we never even think about it. We just take it for granted. Even us, we keep thinking of new ways to use energy. Think Bitcoin. Like 10 years ago, what's a Bitcoin? Now, it's consuming massive amounts of energy. So we need renewables, but we need everything. We need, I'm all for hydrogen. I think it definitely has a role. I'm for fission for sure, nuclear. Fusion has been 30 years out my entire lifetime. I sure hope we get there, because I think it is the holy grail, but we're a long ways from it still. So I think we need all of the above. But the easiest thing we can do today, because we have the technology, is to displace coal with LNG. And that's not going to zero emissions, but it's to vastly reduce emissions. So let's do what we can do. Let's not defer the issue because we can't do the perfect today. Let's do what we can do today and work on the perfect for tomorrow. But we can reduce emissions drastically with LNG today. Why aren't we doing that?
In terms of rising energy demands, what is Jevons paradox?
William Stanley Jevons was a British economist in the 1800s, and he wrote as a young man. He was, 28 or something. He said, as efficiency improves because of technology, you actually use more energy, not less. And he was talking about the British Industrial Revolution. The better and better they designed the steam engine, the more applications it had. So the more coal they used and the more steam engines they were. So that's the 1800s. Here we are in 2023, and it's still true. I use light bulbs as an example. We had incandescent bulbs for decades, for 100 years, and they were great. You burn your fingers on them every time you change them because they're really heaters that give off light. But then we came up with the LED light, 1/10 the energy consumption of an incandescent bulb, absolutely brilliant, fantastic technology, game-changing technology. Now we just use 10 times as many lights, you know, and you look at people's houses, they're all lit up, Christmas lights displays like you've never seen before. You go to the Calgary Zoo or the Telus Park, you know, we use electricity like there's no tomorrow because we got more efficient at it. And it goes for many things. You know, I used in one of my talks, TVs. When I was a child, you had a TV, if a TV at all. But if you had a TV, you were living large. You know, that was the big times. Now you go into any households, there's TVs in, you know, in almost every room. I'm guilty too. You know, my wife and I are empty nesters. Pre-COVID, we really didn't watch much TV, a little more today, but we have 4 TVs in our house, you know, because they're cheap and, you know, they still use electricity when you're not watching them just to keep the circuits and everything warm. So when you turn it on, you don't have to wait 3 seconds. It's on in a nanosecond. You know, our use of electricity, our energy just doesn't stop. And you can, so Jevons paradox still applies today as it did in 1865.
That's the problem.
It was that he wrote about it. It still applies. And of course, you know, that applies here in Canada. I think there's about 1.5 billion people in the world who live our quality of life in regard to energy. So, you know, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. 6.5 billion people don't have that kind of access to energy. So as they get access to better energy, their quality of life will improve, their health will improve, their education will improve, but their demand for energy will also keep increasing too. Because, you know, I ask people, do you think those 6.5 billion people who don't get to live our quality of life, do you think they don't want to live our quality of life? Do you think they don't deserve to live our quality of life? It's really hard to say to other people, you know, you can't have nice offices like this to come to and nice homes that are heated and air conditioned and nice cars to drive. That's for us. You know, that's not an acceptable answer.
That's why we need all energy.
That's why we need all energy. And that's why, you know, to me, we're not going to get to net zero with today's technology. We can improve a lot with nuclear, with LNG, but we can't get to zero. We need new technologies. So that's carbon capture, that's hydrogen, that's more renewables. Tidal's pretty small. Geothermal, where it applies, it's not that relevant in Canada. But we need every technology out there. Fusion, we need them all. Direct air capture. So we sit here and argue which one we should do. We should be pursuing every single one because some of them aren't going to work. Yeah. And I don't know which ones aren't going to work. So let's pursue them all because with today's technology, we're not going to make it. We need new technologies. And I'll use carbon capture as an example. A lot of people are opposed to it because it allows you to continue using oil and gas, which is true. But we are going to be continuing to use oil and gas. So let's do it better. And carbon capture is a big part of that. So on our way to net zero, if we can reduce in the meantime, that seems like a pretty smart thing to do. And let's use the technologies we have today to do what we can today while we develop technologies to really change the game. And we need those new technologies.
To what extent do you think the opaque environmental policies are led just simply by ignorance? For instance, if you go to somewhere like Maui, where 70, 89% of the baseload is imported diesel, in one of the most liberal states, it's quite ironic that they get most of their energy from fossil fuels. To what extent do you think that's just from plain ignorance on energy?
Well, I think to a very large extent. And it's not that people are dumb. I've had this conversation many times here in Alberta where people are saying people don't understand, you know, people in Maui or Ontario or Quebec or Nova Scotia or BC, you know, wherever. They don't understand, you know, where energy comes from and how we use energy. And I ask them, I say, well, how much do you know about the mining industry? How much do you know about the auto industry? How much do you know about the fisheries industry?
It's not even their fault.
You don't know anything because it's not part of your world. So don't expect them to know about energy because it's part of your world. It's up to us to inform people, to educate them, and to have a calm, rational conversation. People all over this country are very intelligent people, but, you know, they have no reason to know about energy. They come into the room, they flick the light on, the light comes on every single time. They never give it a second thought. When was the last time you walked into a room, flicked the light switch on and went, phew, the light came on? I mean, you don't even think about it. So, you know, it's up to us because there's no reason people in other parts of the country should know about energy. It's not part of their daily lives. They may know a lot about the auto industry, you know, fisheries, tech, but they have no reason if it's not their world.
The critics say you're talking your own book because you're an energy executive, although you don't have a company anymore, so your economic interests aren't directly aligned with energy. It sounds like it's more just in the best interests of anybody to have stable energy and to have reliable energy at a low cost. And that's the message you're trying to get out.
Well, certainly, when you look at Canada, reliable energy at low cost has been the foundation of this country. That's why we live the standard of living that we do. And you look at what happened in Germany in the last year, where they got cut off and energy prices skyrocketed, factories shut down because they weren't competitive. And then, of course, you look at the majority of the world, which lacks, the kind of energy abundance we have. They need energy, and also they're developing countries. They don't have the economic capabilities we do. So they need energy, and they need it affordable. And that's the challenge. And that's what makes it so difficult. You can get energy anywhere if you really want, but to make it affordable and sustainable, that's more difficult. But that is the challenge we face as a planet. That's not a Canadian challenge. That's a global challenge.
Do you think life maybe has just got too good, too easy for everybody, and that we just take it for granted, reliable, low-cost energy? And that,
well, as I say, I call it energy arrogance here in Canada. And, I'm as guilty as anybody. I'm not pointing fingers. I lead a very good life, and so I consume energy, but I call it energy arrogance. We yell and scream at each other over energy environmental matters, but only because we have the luxury to do so, because we have cheap, reliable, abundant energy. If we were sitting here, especially last month when it was minus 31 and we had no energy, believe me, we wouldn't be talking about, what projects we should be shutting down. We would be scrambling like crazy. When it gets that cold here in Canada, energy is not a matter of charging your cell phone or watching the hockey game. It's a matter of life and death. But we take it for granted. And I don't see it as a criticism. We should count ourselves fortunate. We are so fortunate. And that's why we live the standard of living we do.
Some people would say the argument not too far from here is I'd rather walk to work. I don't care. Doesn't matter. I'd rather not use fossil fuels. I don't care. I'll go live in the woods. What would your response be to that?
I'm sure there are a few people like that, and hats off to them. It's a free country. Again, we're so fortunate here in Canada. If you want to do that and go live in the woods, having said that, you're going to go live in the woods. You're going to be burning wood now to heat your food, and wood is a terrible source of energy. One, it doesn't have a lot of energy, so you have to burn a lot of it. And two, it also emits CO2, and it also emits a lot of particulates, so that's no solution. If we all went and lived in the woods, can you imagine if everybody in Calgary decided we're not using fossil fuels, we're going to burn wood at home? Can you imagine what our air would look like? So it's not that easy. But I would say, first of all, I would highly encourage anybody to think of alternate forms to get around, not just to work, than driving your car. At Modern Resources, there was 25 of us, probably 15 of us, including myself, rode our bikes to work. And I would say we did it certainly because it was in our DNA, just the environmental aspect, but I would say mostly because it was the easiest, most pleasant way to get to work. I live for 3 kilometers from downtown, so it was easier than driving. It was easier than the bus. It was much more pleasant, especially with the bike lanes today. So I would highly encourage anybody to look at their life. And, 80% of the emissions from a barrel of oil are you and me. 20% are in the production, refining, distribution. 80% is you and me. Every time we start our car, every time we take a flight, go on a cruise. So before we start pointing our fingers at anybody, let's look in the mirror. What can we do better? And again, I'm as guilty as anybody else. I'm not pointing fingers. But that's the really hard part. I tell people all the time, it's really easy to be an environmentalist when I tell you what to do. It's really hard when I have to look at what I have to do. Yeah.
If you're going to go live in the woods, go live in the woods. But it seems like people come back to civilization pretty quickly and forget about what they tell other people to do, especially if they fly to Davos and go to conferences like that.
Well, all of us, I don't want to say COVID's over because it's not, but certainly we're getting closer to a pre-COVID lifestyle. So, in the last year, my wife and I went to Palm Desert. We went to the Bahamas, visited friends. We went to Spain cycling for 3 weeks. Are we guilty? Absolutely. Am I willing to give up all that? One less trip a year? Okay. Not travel at all? I don't think so. I'm not there. And so it's really difficult when we have to look in the mirror. And what do I have to do? It's really easy for me to say, Trevor, you can't travel. But me, well, maybe a little bit.
In your opinion, like we talked about earlier, the environmental policies that seem to be backfiring, where do you think those originate from? Is it from people just not understanding the industry? Is it from envy and greed, perception that energy executives make so much money? Or where do you think that comes from?
Well, probably all of the above. I'd say all of the above. I would say it comes primarily from a passion of wanting a better environment. That's a strong motivator.
Right.
I share that.
Yeah. Exactly.
I share that. So I can fully understand that. And first of all, I think virtually everybody shares that. I don't want to say everybody, but virtually everybody. So I don't fault their objective of a better environment. I am 1000% in favor of that too. But let's start having a calm conversation on how to get there, because just, shutting down the oil and gas industry tomorrow, it's not realistic. It's not going to happen.
Well, that's awesome. If you were to point somebody who maybe listens to this in the right direction in terms of where to learn more about the benefits of traditional energy, where would you say to start looking?
One group that I'm a big fan of is Energy Minute, which is some young people here in Calgary who have taken it upon themselves to inform people about energy. And when I say energy, I'm not talking oil and gas. I mean energy. This is electricity, geothermal, hydrogen, everything. They put out a couple of short newsletters once a week, and it's usually very pictorial. It takes a minute or less to digest, but they're very informative. And I think they do a great job of simplifying a very complicated issue.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. Maybe I'll catch you for any one of these days for a little powder that we never seem to get at Lake Louise. So,
well, I'm ready for that.
Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. If you liked what you heard, check out roadsbros.ca, where we will have upcoming shows. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.